I like to start with a question. In this age we're currently living in, of Black Lives Matter protests, of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, of NBA Finals games where the players compete with terms and phrases like liberation and justice and equality on the back of their jerseys, where Hollywood is said to be in the midst of a Black renaissance, producing more diverse films than they ever have, where we're waking up every day to more and more anti-racist discourse, new books being published, new articles being written about racism and white supremacy and injustice and histories and stats and figures. Are we learning to love Black people, or are we just finally getting used to the idea of hating racism and white supremacy? I ask this question because I think there's a very important distinction between the two. While to some it might sound like simple semantics, the difference between learning to love a group of people and learning to hate or be critical of a set of systems, institutions, and/or conditions, those two things are very different. And they have different outcomes because they target different places, right? What I want to do today in this talk is get everyone here in the audience today thinking about what it might look like to make the pursuit of Black happiness a part of the political work currently being done around the issue of race. I want you all to think about what it would mean to prioritize Black life, Black happiness, Black joy, Black pleasure, as opposed to thinking only about the kinds of institutions that impact or preclude that thing as a possibility. I came to this topic while thinking about what it was I wanted to do when I decided to submit for TED. I started a conversation with a friend who I was asking for feedback. And my initial thought was that I would do something related to my research. I am a scholar of African American culture, and I'm presently working on a project that looks at the political importance of the African American gangster figure, particularly in the post-civil rights moment, right? And how criminalization becomes the primary framework through which certain policies, practices, and historical logics get recreated in an era when we're supposedly past racism, right? Past segregation, past slavery, and so on and so forth. And so when I started explaining to her what it was I was looking to do or talk about, I launched into this crazy soliloquy about criminalization and outlawry and citizenship and racism and oppression and, all of these, what basically amount today to buzzwords, right? And topics. And the more I spoke, the more I could see her getting less and less interested, caring less and less about what it is I was saying. And she let me know when I finished that her issue wasn't so much that what I was saying wasn't relevant or wasn't interesting, right? But that it just wasn't for her right now. She told me that she's now tired of feeling like every conversation about Black people inevitably turns to suffering, to oppression, to racism, for all intents and purposes, right? To those parts of Black life that make living difficult. And it wasn't her words so much that hit me as it was her tone. Because I could hear in her voice that she was literally tired, right? Not figure of speech like, it's a lot, but literally tired, drained, fatigued. And it made me start thinking about my own experience and some of the things that I felt in recent times. And this is as someone who has signed up to study these things, right? I make my money, I pay my bills, studying, reading about, writing about, speaking about Black life, Black history, and a huge part of that is suffering. A huge part of that is oppression. It's very hard to talk about Black people without addressing those subjects. And I myself have felt tired at times from that and just not wanting to do it. And so I can only imagine then what somebody who hasn't signed up to do that work feels being confronted with it every day. Now that anti-racist discourse, now that protests, now that a certain kind of political activism has entered this phase of just being in vogue, right? It's everywhere now, where a certain kind of protest, a certain kind of discourse has always existed in this country. Today, it's on every bookshelf, every TV channel, every news cycle, even in our leisurely activities on TV. So imagine going into work every day, right? Imagine being a middle school teacher and walking in to a staff meeting. We all know what staff meetings are like, right? We all work jobs. We all know how stressful it can be. We all know how tiring it can be. We all know how some days you just walk into work and you're just not feeling it. Now imagine having a day like that and walking into a staff meeting, and today we're talking about racism. And not only are we talking about racism, you're asked to evaluate how much progress you think this country has made on the issue of racism since Martin Luther King. And as only one or two Black people in the room, you now feel pressured to offer expert opinions or expert testimony on something that is not your field of expertise. You teach math. You teach science. You teach history or language arts, but what you are not is an expert on the history of racism or the current state of race in America. You're armed with nothing but your experience. And now this conversation is part of that experience, and nobody cares, or nobody seems to realize it. What you're being asked in that moment now is to labor for the sake of others, despite the fact that this conversation is being pitched as being beneficial for you and people like you. How does that feel? And does what you feel in that moment feel like progress? Do you feel like we're making strides towards the amelioration of Black oppression, of Black suffering? Or is this a moment where we start to realize that maybe what we think of as progress is actually just the re-scripting of that suffering, of that oppression? And we're now engaging in those very same practices, just in ways that are more palatable to the collective conscience of our society. We get to feel good saying we talked about racism without ever thinking about what that conversation is doing for the people it's supposed to be benefiting, right? That's at work for a lot of people now. Now imagine that being your day at work. And not only did you have to put up with that at work, you also had to deal with the kind of normalized micro and macro aggressions that you deal with on the street, in the grocery store, the library, wherever it is you go in your daily routine. And then you come home for an opportunity to just turn off. You flip on the TV and you just want to see Black people on TV. And they tell you that we're in the midst of a Black renaissance in Hollywood. So there should be plenty for you to choose from, right? But so much of that material is heavy. It's difficult. In the last 5 years, how many major Hollywood productions featuring majority Black casts have not used Black trauma, Black suffering, Black oppression, Black tragedy as its value proposition, as its centerpiece? I'm sure you could name a few. But how does that list of films that meet that criteria compare to the potentially much longer list of films that don't. Think about the Judas and the Black Messiahs, the Queen and Slims, the Selmas, these very important films that communicate very important moments in history to wider audiences that might not otherwise be aware. But you're not seeking awareness, right? Especially as someone who lives with the implications of those moments every day. You encounter them in your daily life. How does it feel to want to watch a movie? To want to watch the latest of whatever Black movie is being produced? And it's just more difficulty. It's more of the hard stuff. While Hollywood has made strides in diversifying its cast, it seems as if they may have forgotten about the low-stakes feel-good film. As if Black people aren't looking for the Black when Harry met Sally, right? What about that movie? And how many of them do we feel okay with producing? It's an interesting question, right? But it goes back to my original point about loving Black people, right? What does it look like when we make Black joy, Black pleasure, Black happiness an explicit part of our current political pursuit of progress on the race question? What happens? What differences are there in how we go about that pursuit? We talk a lot right now about Black life and Black liberty, but what about the Black pursuit of happiness? Are we prepared to make that an explicit part of our political activism, an explicit goal of Black freedom? For those of us who are already actively engaged in making sure we're on the right side of history, quote unquote, are we actually doing enough to make sure that the people we claim to be fighting on the behalf of actually feel loved, actually feel cared for, they actually feel compassion and consideration? And not just to the extent that we're pushing back against a set of failing institutions. We have to recognize that there is a difference between hating and critiquing racism and white supremacy and actually engaging or meeting the Black community with an ethic of love. We have to think more clearly and more comprehensively about that. And in making this point, I don't want to erase those who are already doing this work. There are plenty of people who you can find whose work on these issues is rooted in love. But at what point does that become the norm as opposed to the exception? At what point does Black love or the love of Black people reach the kind of critical mass that we're currently seeing on the progressive side of American politics on the question of anti-racism, or rather the topic of anti-racism? What does it look like? That's the question that I want us to walk away with in mind. What does it mean to love Black people? What kind of questions do we ask ourselves when we're thinking about love? What do we know about Black joy? How much do we know about Black pleasure? The Black orgasm, Black sexuality? We can find a wealth of research, a wealth of articles about Black people not having access to job opportunities, but how much do we know about what Black people do when they take a day off? What do Black people do when they go on vacation? We know about those things that stand in the way of Black people pursuing their dreams, but how much do we know about what it is Black people are dreaming of? We have to start to ask ourselves, what does progress look like if in our pursuit of progress, we aren't actually thinking about what it is we want as opposed to what we're attempting to get rid of? Black love, the love of Black people, must be an intentional act. It will not arrive as a byproduct of ending racism or white supremacy. We must make sure that in seeking progress, we are engaged in practices that are ultimately just taking the suffering that already exists and reinscribing it in new terms. We have to make it a goal to make sure that there is some joy, some happiness, some pleasure in Black life in the absence of the oppression and systemic issues that we're presently fighting against. Thank you.